On behalf of the American Slavery Project and the New York Society for Ethical Culture, we welcome you to this special presentation of our 2021 Reverberations plays. Thank you to all of our supporters and viewers for joining us in this exciting virtual series. Be sure to stick around after the performance for a live scholar-led talkback, which will shed light on some of the ideas and themes in the play. We hope you enjoy the show and will meet us again for some other upcoming virtual premieres in the Reverberation plays. Please consider donating to ASP so we can continue the work that we do, creating theater that educates, entertains, and illuminates. Now on to the show.
I remember the day Donald Trump was elected president. I was at school bawling my eyes out and fearing for my life. I'd never been fond of Donald Trump. He was a man who loved everything gold and came to power thinking he was a king. His presidency was a reign of terror. My mother and I come from ethnic backgrounds. My mother immigrated from the Dominican Republic. She saved up money working in a factory while trying to get an education to do better for her future children. She immigrated to New York City at 18 years old for a better opportunity to live out her dreams of one day having a family and watching them get educations, grow up, and have a better life than she had. Then she had a kid, me, with a white Puerto Rican man who left us in poverty so that we were living paycheck to paycheck and from government assistance. My mom has worked so hard for me to have a better life than she had growing up, wanting me to be able to have a good education and a high-paying job. Then that man was elected and began 4 years of suffering for us. If I were to sit here and tell you every single thing he's done to negatively impact immigrants, I'd have to write an entire novel. He tried to strip away our health care, my mom's government assistance, my family's safety net. He built an entire wall to keep people from coming from Mexico to live out their dreams too. And he tried to end LGBTQ rights. I'm transgender, multiracial, and there's a lot of expectations and a lot of pressure on me. Like I've always had something to prove. I don't fit into any of my communities. I'm too black to be Dominican and Puerto Rican, and too Dominican and Puerto Rican to be black. I'm always having to prove my blackness to other black people, and it's really stressful. Also, with being transgender, I'm always having to prove that I'm a guy. It's like no matter how masculine I dress and how deep my voice is, there's always that group of people that somehow see me as a woman and misgender me. And that's why I was at school bawling my eyes out and fearing for my life and for what was to come. The constant fear of being hate crimed, the increasing poverty, even in places like California, Washington, Florida, New York, places that are supposed to be the best places in the world, are more like the opposite. Land of the free is more like land of the death, especially when majority minorities are being killed and jailed every day, more than white people have ever been. My mother never imagined an America like this. And that's why when I got home that afternoon, she was upset too. I bet she never once imagined that the U.S. would be so terrifying. That day, I saw how minorities like me often have no voice in this country despite how hard we work to get here. Unfortunately, that's the reality that people like us have to face. Many minorities that immigrated to the United States are convinced that it's this utopia where you can escape poverty and corrupt government, when in reality, the United States is a modern day third world country. I'll never forget the feeling of true celebration and freedom when Donald Trump got out of office. I'm just glad he's out. And our new president is working to make things easier for my community. All of my communities.
What does it mean to be an immigrant in America? It means you have a need that is always there, sitting in your gut like the pit in a peach, or the back of your mind like an ever-present whisper. It says you have to rise above expectations placed upon you by others. It means to be a gifted child cast to a low-level bilingual class, until the school slowly realizes you should have been placed in honors English. It means to continuously challenge yourself to work harder, to prove yourself, prove that you're capable enough, smart enough, skilled enough, and talented enough to take on the world and the boulders it rolls onto your path. That voice tells you, strive, make a life for yourself. A life where a carefully framed master's degree hangs on the freshly painted gray walls of your new office. A life where that degree is meticulously placed above a photograph of your smiling family in a charming suburban house. What does it mean to be an immigrant in America? It means to have the choice: crack under the pressure, or destroy the generational patterns that your parents and the ones before them have endured. Patterns of poverty, lack of education, shattered dreams, and settling for the bare minimum. Like spending all day slowly pushing your child's stroller down an endless line of worried mothers in hopes of a chance at an EBT card. It means to do better, be better, to honor the sacrifices your parents made. Your father leaving you behind, voyaging to America to set up your family's lives, to achieve everything they couldn't have fathomed back in the homes they left. Mother relentlessly scrubbing, dusting, sweeping, and mopping office floors from 9 to 5. To arrive in this country as a non-English-speaking 5-year-old, ready to conquer the world. It means assimilating to a world where being different isn't always celebrated, becoming a master at hiding my native tongue, in fear of being ridiculed and belittled by others. What does it mean to be an immigrant in America? It means not everyone shares an equal piece of the American pie. Opportunities often pass you by. It means waking early to the scent of pumpkin-spiced candles and sliding into your newly ironed black business attire headed to a day of filing papers and chatting with your coworker Karen about which dressing works best with her salad, without losing sight of your own roots and commemorating how you came from the sounds of tambores and marimba and the sweet, everlasting taste of habichuela con dulce. It means to shed parts of your identity to fit the expected norm, while also being part of a system that was never meant to serve you. To be an immigrant in America is to grow up to see how there are evil forces that will try to stop you from reaching too high or dreaming too big. Evil forces that allow racists to become presidents, create racist laws, talk down to people like me, label us violent thieves. It means to wake up to watch your own president say, they're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people, while millions cheer But being an immigrant is also about strength. And not letting a narrow-minded leader or any of his devoted fans define who we are. We still stand. We stand proud. We persevere through it all. And so to be an immigrant in America is to say, I am worthy of being here. I am deserving of triumphs. I am deserving of greatness. And I deserve to achieve my own American dream.
My name is Margaret Andrews, 23 years old, good endurance. I resemble my father in physique. Weight, 122 pounds. Height standing, 61 inches. Girth of head, 22 inches. Breadth of head, 6.5 inches. Medium brown eyes, straight, medium brown hair. A very high forehead, thin lips. Nose was originally straight, but was severely broken in a basketball game at Smith College and not properly set. Basketball was one of the reasons I chose Smith. The first women's basketball game was played there in 1893, and their continuing dedication to athletics made them an ideal match for me.
Her name is Hazel, the note said. No more, no less. It was tucked in my blanket when they found me on the doorstep. I dream about my mother sometimes. Not Mrs. Wilson, the one that found me, but my real mother, the one I never knew. I dream she was the color of cocoa and smelled like ginger soap. She worked in the laundry, I heard, and that's where she met my daddy. Daddy was a Chinaman. Grown-ups whisper it whenever they think I'm not close enough to hear. They say,
I heard that Chinaman was working out west on the railroad when he found out his wife refused to travel across the ocean to be with him.
They'd say,
That Chinaman was so aggrieved, he tried to drive a spike into his own heart, but at the last minute drove it into that piece of iron track instead.
Then he put down his hammer and followed the railroad line as far east as it would take him.
Then they shake their heads and say, too bad for me, my mother was immoral. They say she was a whore on account of the fact she lay down with that sad-eyed Chinaman and grew me in her belly. But I don't think she was a whore. I think she was lonely. I think she wanted to feel that Chinaman's strong arms around her and hold on to something more than an armful of hot, wet laundry and smell something better than detergent and lye.
Unfortunately, though I was born with a love of basketball, I wasn't born with the proper body to play it well. Had I been taller, that ball wouldn't have broken my nose when it bounced off the rim. But the primary reason I chose Smith College was for their social work program. It's arguably the best in the country. And the best is what we should all aspire to. The best for ourselves, the best for our country, the best for the world. And it's why I left Michigan and my Midwest roots to attend college in the East, in Massachusetts, and then on to New York. I was beside myself when I was given this extraordinary job offer with the Eugenics Records Office in Cold Spring Harbor.
Today, this lady, Miss Andrews, came to look at me. She says she's trying to make people better. No, trying to make better people.
Our work is funded by some of the most important people in the country. The Carnegie Institution, the Rockefeller Foundation, Mr. J.H. Kellogg, the Harriman Railroad people, and dedicated to the belief that through selective breeding, and in certain special cases, sterilization, the human species can direct its own evolution.
She say I'm immoral because I didn't go to school past the 4th grade and had a baby when I was 12 years old.
In kindergarten, I instinctively helped the children who had trouble adjusting, befriending them, playing with them, cajoling them into making themselves an active, productive part of our school community to the best of their individual abilities. And in grammar school, I was always drawn to help the children who, unlike me, struggled with arithmetic or reading or spelling and grammar, encouraging them to live up to their potential, whatever level that was. On summer vacations, when I visited my grandparents and relatives on their farms in Ohio, I always made sure the chicks and calves were nurtured so they could grow up to give the best eggs and milk and meat. This compassion, this desire to help, isn't something I was taught. It's how I was born. On both sides of my family, going back as many generations as anyone can name, I come from intelligent, successful farmers, people who nurtured plants and animals and helped them grow. My mother is a nurturing woman. My father became a doctor to help people. I was bred to be caring.
Then she'd take a ruler and measure every part of my face, top to bottom, side to side, between my eyes, bridge of my nose. She say my nose is flat and my hair is kinky, and that's how she can tell I'm not very smart.
As a field worker, I interview people. I take measurements, document family histories regarding talents and intelligence, illnesses and handicaps, and in certain cases make recommendations. Everything is scrupulously filled out on individual analysis cards and pedigree charts, and I write up a full report about each subject and family. I'm particularly drawn to collecting data about the least fortunate, those who range from idiot through low, medium, and high-grade imbecile, all the way up to moron. I speak to them kindly and with respect, but in the simplest terms possible.
She smiles at me and says my mental age is 11 years and 8 months. When I frown, she says,
Not to worry, you're average for your race.
and she points to a picture that says,
Moron.
I don't know how she figures that, 'cause by my count, I got 17 years of living behind me now, and I managed to outrun Mr. Wilson and half the neighborhood boys for nearly 12 of them. I'd say that makes me pretty smart.
Every farmer knows that one breeds the best specimens, and when one has an inferior cow or pig or sheep, one removes it from the herd, so those defects don't get passed on to future generations. Does that sound callous when talking about human beings? It shouldn't. We test people to determine whether or not they're fit to drive a car. Is procreation less important than transportation?
As far back as I can remember, Mr. Wilson liked me. Not like a real father's supposed to. Not enough to hug me or read to me or take me to the river and set a paper boat afloat. But sometimes he called me China with so tender a voice, my heart would swell. Then he'd pat my bottom. It was the only time anyone ever touched me, except to beat me.
When one is dealing with an adult who has the mental capacity of a 6 or 8 or 11-year-old, it's important to remember it's not their fault. They are living up to the full potential their genetic chain has bred them to have. So I explain things as best I can to the extent they'll be able to comprehend. And we get along wonderfully.
When I was 6 and the older children had been sent away to school, Mrs. Wilson got busy with a Negro women's suffrage group, and Mr. Wilson's pats on my bottom gave way to something more. At first, Mrs. Wilson didn't seem to notice, but that just made Mr. Wilson bolder. Then she noticed, and the bolder he got, the madder she got. The madder she got, the bigger the broom she used to beat me. One day she was so mad, she told me,
I'll send you back to China. They'll break your feet and stuff 'em in the little shoes. Stop making Mr. Wilson like you.
but I couldn't. I didn't know how.
You know how people often say that everything in their lives up to a certain moment led them to, prepared them for that thing, that opportunity, that whatever? I believe that because everything in my life, everything in my genetics, led me to become a eugenics field worker.
On my way to and from the market for Mrs. Wilson, I would pass dirty-faced women and men huddled by fires or sleeping in doorways. I'd gotten friendly with one or two after doing the marketing and would stay with them as long as I could before Mrs. Wilson grew impatient and came looking for me. Dragging me back to the house, she'd say,
You come from that filth. Is that where you want to end up?
"No," I'd say, guilty-like. But they were kind to me, especially Ruthie, who smelled like dark roasted coffee. She'd hold me close for warmth and teach me how to blow on a pair of dice for her boyfriends. They were all foul-mouthed and carried pocket knives, but gave me a penny or two if they won at craps. I spent my pennies at the corner store, where I put on a smile for the man at the till after I'd filled my pockets with buttons and beads I hadn't paid for. Ruthie laughed when I brought her the little gifts. She combed my hair and asked me how a pretty girl like me could look so glum. But I could see in her eyes she already knew. By the time I was 9 or 10, I'd stopped going to school altogether. It's not that I didn't like school. I did. I liked the stories and the numbers and the little science experiments. I could even put up with the kids who called me
Orphan.
and. But the days when Mrs. Wilson was busy with suffrage and Mr. Wilson left work early to pick me up, those days were hard. I had to think of so many things to occupy myself to slip out of Mr. Wilson's grasp. The house was spotless. And Mrs. Wilson had grown to look at me like a cross between the devil and an old steamer trunk. Too heavy to lift, but too useful to throw away. She said I was her burden to bear and then handed me a mop and a scrub brush. When I was 12, I started to bleed. I was so scared I ran to Ruthie, who told me I had to be very, very careful now, especially around men. By February, I'd begun to show. Not much, just a bump, but Mrs. Wilson understood what had happened, and without a word, she took me to court and told them that I was not going to school, that I was a thief, incorrigible, and inclined to associate with heathens and criminals. Without asking me a thing, they sent me to the State Home for Girls in Trenton. And it is just like home. They give you cold baths and a good flogging if you disobey. Except it took them 3 months to figure out that I was ready to have a baby. When they did realize it, they sent me to Clinton Farms. It was a home for girls, too. They didn't flog you or put you in ice baths or give you dark bottles of liquid to drink to make you nauseous like at State. No, they talked to you and asked you questions.
I'll always fondly remember the first person I interviewed, a lovely young half-Chinese negress named Hazel. Immoral and a moron, but completely average for her race.
But Clinton Farms also cut open my stomach, pulled out my baby, then stitched me up and sent me back to the state home without her. I got word that she died 6 weeks later after 3 days of convulsions and a bad stomach. Maybe if I had held her, touched her, nursed her like I saw mothers do. I hate to think she thought I didn't want her, that she was lonely when she died.
Apparently, the news about the baby had sent Hazel into deep melancholy.
There were classes at the state home, and I threw myself into them so I wouldn't think of my little girl I never had a chance to name. It wasn't book learning like school with the Wilsons, but I picked up sewing and how to cane wicker chairs.
Obviously, a society requires a population with a wide spectrum of abilities, some who are capable of being leaders, others who need only be up to middle management or menial work.
I should have pretended I couldn't use my hands so they would let me read more, but they said I'd reach my grade limit.
Studies show that Negroes and Southern Europeans have less intellectual and leadership ability than Anglo-Saxons, as well as greater immorality. But in every subgroup, there are fascinating anomalies which need to be flagged and studied further if we are to truly fulfill our mission.
They told me they had found me a family to live with and a laundry for me to work in during my parole. A laundry, like where my mother met my father. I didn't like the soap or the heat, the way my hands would dry up and wrinkle. I had a scar like a rope the length of my belly and didn't like the way it pulled when I was lifting the large bundles from the boiling pot into the spinner. I worked and slept, ate and dreamed and watched the steam rise over the tubs of boiling shirts. One day, I was dropping newsprint on the floor as I was stacking clean starched shirts when I saw my own name in a headline. It was next to the picture of a famous tennis player. I could read the whole story. The words were simple enough. She was immoral too, like me. I started to think, even with everything I'd done, running away, stealing, making Mr. Wilson like me too much, there's a chance I could still make a life for myself, be somebody, love somebody. And then, the very next week, Wen came to work in the laundry. He stopped short when he saw my face, but not like it was strange, like it was familiar. He asked me something in Chinese I didn't understand. Then in broken English, he asked me why I didn't speak Chinese. I told him about my daddy and the railroad and the spike and my mama leaving me on the doorstep. He listened. When he said my name, he said each part separate. Ha-Zel, he called me. And I laughed for the first time since they took my baby and she died. The next week, I lay down with Wen behind the wash pots on a pile of dirty dresses, and I could smell ginger and feel that Chinaman's strong arms around me. I held on to him like my mother held on to her man, and for the first time in my life, I understood what she must have felt. For the first time in my life, I felt something like love. When I told Wen we were going to have a baby, he asked me to run away with him to New York City. More money there, better work. I said I was 17 and running away is what put me in jail in the first place. He said he couldn't wait, he had to go. He said to come find him when I turned 18, bring the baby to him, and we live in Chinatown and raise him together. We would work in a store or a restaurant. I tried to wait, to forget, but it felt like my insides were breaking. 2 weeks later, I closed the laundry, and instead of going home, I got on a bus to New York City. But before I could find when, the police found me and brought me back here to the state home. Last week, my second baby was born at the Mercer Hospital. The doctors cut me again down the length of my belly and pulled the baby out. This time, they won't tell me if it was a boy or girl. They won't let me see it. They won't let me hold it.
We decided it was better not to tell her the second baby died. It would have been confusing and cruel to put her through that again when it was clearly more than she was capable of comprehending.
They only sent Miss Andrews to measure my nose and my eyes and my face, to look for signs in my face that I am immoral and rate me on the imbecile scale. She says I can't reason. She says I can't help it. She smiles and says that it's inherited and that some races are by nature inferior, but not to worry because I won't pass it on again. Tomorrow they will give me an operation. Tomorrow they will take out my tubes and ovaries.
After the second, the doctors agreed that another pregnancy would prove fatal to Hazel. But she could no better be expected to understand that, or to understand how to stop from becoming pregnant, than I could be expected to engineer one of Mr. Harriman's locomotives. Actually, given my genetic makeup, I'm certain I could be taught to engineer a locomotive if it were necessary, but that's not the point. The point is, or was, that to save Hazel's life, I had to recommend sterilization.
She says it is to save my life and to save someone else's life.
It wasn't an easy recommendation for a 21-year-old to make.
She says if I continue to be immoral, if I try to have another baby, I will probably die.
But it was the right decision for Hazel and for society.
Maybe so, but seems to me I've already died 1,000 deaths.
We can direct our own evolution.
I called this baby Win. And when I imagine heaven, I see him there with little Hazel holding hands. And they are not lonely. They are not immoral. They are themselves, and they have each other.
everybody. How are you? Welcome back. I am Judy Tate, the producing artistic director and co-founder of the American Slavery Project. I am in Catskills, up in the Catskills. I'm zooming in from the land of the Kanien'kehá:ka, or Mohawk people, and the Algonquian-speaking peoples. These were one of the 5 nations of the Haudenosaunee. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but we know them historically as the Iroquois Confederacy. So I wanted to make that land acknowledgement. I hope you enjoyed our premiere of The Haunted Files and our monologue mission. It's the first time we've commissioned works from high school students, but I'm so excited to be engaging them in this kind of work and to understand what's going on in the world. And we need to hear their voices because policy, as it is set, affects people, and I think that's what people don't really know. I want to give a shout out to Amy Whitting and the International Theater Project for co-commissioning. Thanks for sticking around and joining us for this post-show panel. We've got 2 incredible guests here. We've got Jack Chen. Hi, Jack.
Hi.
And Leora Fuller. Hi, Leora, who I met. Did I have the date right? Was it 2014 when we first met? It was 2 years after I had started Unheard Voices, and that was a project that the American Slavery Project did, trying to give voice to the voiceless at the African burial ground. And so when I read that you guys, and I'm going to do a little bit of your bio so the audience understands, but when I met you, I was flabbergasted that these existed. So let me just tell you guys out there who Jack Chen and Leora Fuller are. Okay, so who have I got up here? I've got Leora first. Leora is an artist and facilitator. She currently teaches at Rutgers University, Newark, where she founded the Translocal Learning Studio, a virtual studio for developing and expanding accountable, transformative, and community-centered learning practices. Leora has organized classes on environmental justice, subaltern history, and transmutual aid, often incorporating new technologies such as AR, VR, and digital mapping. She has taught at New York University, led storytelling and learning workshops at the New School, CUNY Grad Center, and NJIT, and also curated several exhibits as co-founder of the Below the Grid Lab, including Haunted Files, the Eugenics Record Office, In the Shadow of the Highway, Robert Moses and the Battle for Downtown, 2015 and 16, and Lost Streets, Seward Park's Fight for Housing Justice. Thank you so much, Leora, for joining us. I'm so happy to once again be doing this again. And then on my screen, anyway, down at the bottom, I don't know about you guys out there what your screen is saying, but I have Jack Chen. And Jack is, let me just turn to the top of your bio here. He is a historian, curator, writer, dumpster diver, devoted to anti-racist, anti-colonialist, democratic participatory storytelling, scholarship, and opening up archives, museums, organizations, and classroom spaces to the stories and realities of those excluded and deemed unfit in master narratives. Professor Chen has been honored to be the inaugural Clement A. Price Professor of Public History and Humanities at Rutgers University, Newark, and the director of the Clement Price Institute on Ethnicity, Culture, and the Modern Experience since the fall of 2018. He's been doing eco-justice work most recently, and his ongoing series of work on eugenics, which is how we met and which this is a part of when they originally recreated the Eugenics Records Office. I'm not going to read a whole lot of this because this is going to be part of our conversation. His ongoing series of work on eugenics surfaces how patrician elites fashioned a tested, measured, sorted, tiered, hierarchical system of fit European descended Nordics on top and the rankings of the great majority of unfit below, resulting in the Immigration Act of 1924 and practices of sterilization, which you heard just a little bit ago. That are all still impacting US political culture to this day. He is working with faculty from the University College in London, commemorating, you'll talk about this later, Jack, right? Commemorating the 100th anniversary of the eugenics conference. Okay, so we're gonna we're gonna dive in here. Thank you, Jack. Thank you for coming. So I know everybody out there, we had a little blurb before the duologue, and but you want to give again, and I just said a little bit, but I know people are saying, what is eugenics? We've never heard of it. This in all of those slides and things that you saw, and the kind of horrible cartoons and that you saw. How is it that people don't know about this? What is it? How did the eugenics record office fit into the entire movement? Is it related to white supremacy today? If so, how? I know that's a lot of questions in one, but that's my first question.
Well, maybe I'll start and you pick up and we'll go back and forth.
Yeah, we'll just have a conversation. That's what we like here at ASP.
So eugenics comes out of, it's coined by Sir Francis Galton, who's in London. And he, in fact, was based at the University College of London. And he framed the term eugenics as being well-born. Now, okay, so we can kind of start thinking about what that means. Now so it comes out of plant breeding, horse breeding, chicken breeding, the idea that we can control, characteristics of this chicken, of that horse to improve, right, their ability to do certain things, to run faster, to lay more eggs, whatever it may be. And it's really an effort to apply it to human beings and to say that we can control and manage human evolution. And what he was talking about was so-called positive eugenics, which was that well-bred people and beautiful people and intelligent people should marry each other and have beautiful and even better bred children and even more intelligent children. So that was really how it began in 1883.
Wow.
But then as it got transplanted into other places, including Germany, United States, other places, this kind of idea of negative eugenics began becoming dominant. And that was in which this idea that, unfit people should be sorted out of the population. So there's this culling kind of idea. So that, if you've got a weak chicken, a weak little chick, you should cull it out of the group so that you're not reproducing that weakness, right? So this is applied to humans and said that all sorts of people are unfit. And it's really largely driven by kind of racial hierarchies. And therefore, even amongst Europeans, there would be considered the superior Europeans, who were the Northern and Western Europeans, the so-called Nordics. And then there are all these inferior Europeans, Central Europeans, Mediterranean, God forbid, Europeans were all seen as inferior, right? Those Italians, right? So we've got to call them out. But it was initiated, of course, after the Civil War. And so, eugenics kind of emerged out of scientific racism and the racial practices and white supremacy practices after, before the Civil War, but it continued especially after the Civil War, when Jim Crow gets developed, but also the Chinese Exclusion Act was passed in 1882. So it's another thing that Americans don't know much about, just like eugenics has been kind of hidden. And it's really part of why we came up with this idea of the haunted files. So Lior, maybe you should take it from there, but I just wanted to set it up a little bit.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jack. Yeah, I think part of, to the point of why we don't know about this history, in addition to things like the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is actually sort of a series of laws beginning in the 1870s and continuing on until the 1920s and then extended until 1968. Part of the reason we don't know these histories is because they're actually were so prominent amongst the elites. So these are histories that have been sort of deliberately hidden and sort of marginalized because they're embarrassing, because especially after World War II, when the horrors of the Holocaust and the implications of eugenics within that came to light, and America sort of began to portray itself as sort of this global power that was policing the world in democratic ways. It didn't want to be associated with the bad guys, right? And the practices there. Even though historically many of the practices that the Germans and the science that the Germans used to justify the science that the Germans used to justify the Holocaust actually was deeply influenced and inspired and directly connected to the Americans doing this work at the Eugenics Record Office. Charles Davenport, who was the sort of second in command there, or the first in command, he was the director of the Eugenics Record Office. Him and his second in command, Harry Laughlin, traveled to Nazi Germany at various points. So that's all just to say that these histories are actually deeply, deeply connected to many of the institutions that support systemic racism, systemic oppression today, and are very much a lack of reckoning, like America likes to do, doesn't want to reckon with its dirty laundry, whether that's sort of racism, Jim Crow, whatever it is, and eugenics is another part of that. So that's a big reason why, and very deliberately beginning in the sort of 1930s, 1940s, the scientific community actively extricated eugenicists from them and deliberately sort of quieted that history. But we're talking about people like Teddy Roosevelt, right? The American Museum of Natural History was where the Eugenics International Conferences were, right? So this is not like subtle thing in a dark corner and, oh my God, as soon as we found out about it, we got rid of it. It's like, this is American history. These are the prominent players that we think of as sort of the great men of American history, who, just like when we think about Washington and Jefferson and their relationship to slavery, these sort of progressive era politicians and leaders are also connected to these darker, insidious scientific racist ideas.
So people actually thought this was science, or did they know it was pseudoscience and go? I mean, and can I just underscore something that you just said? The Germans studied Jim Crow laws in America, right? How can you separate these people from those people and make them use separate bathrooms and separate this and they studied our Jim Crow laws and then perfected them in Germany by contact with these people and perfected them to be the final solution, basically. And when we saw what was going on, that's how eugenics office that's how it blew up.
So eugenics, as well as scientific racism beforehand, was obsessed with measuring every human part of the body. So that's why so I'm really, first of all, I should say that I thought you did a great job.
Oh, thank you.
In that montage, you really kind of captured a lot of the historical references with the audio background. So I thought it was really beautifully done.
Yeah, and those actors just heart-wrenching.
Yeah. Every time I listen to it and see it. But so in one of the scenes, you see calipers, which are ways of measuring noses, body parts, but especially things like the forehead and kind of measuring the capacity of the brain, So these were all really driven by racial hierarchies. And of course, the white male was seen as having a more upright forehead and therefore was more rational, and that lower human beings were considered to have sloped heads. So in part, you get the kind of, they're more like monkeys, or one of the derisive terms to call Asians are slopeheads, right? To denote their racial inferiority or their closeness to the apes. So all of that, that obsession about measurement and everything else was very much part of the scientific nature of objectifying human body parts and therefore determining who is inferior and who is superior. So that's part of the answer.
So one of the things that when I was going through your files back in 2014, and I found this record of Hazel, the thing that stood out to me the most was that so much of what they said was genetic were social problems. Poverty. Poverty. She's in an abusive home. She's, being abused. Orphans were not treated with the the kind of enlightened idea that, oh yes, human beings need primary attachment and love and the things that we know today. Did no one think that these social problems might have something to do with policy?
Well, I think that is very much connected to sort of a history in the United States, beginning in sort of the mid 1800s into the progressive era, in which the waves of immigrants were arriving, in masses in the sort of highest amount beginning in the sort of middle of the 19th century and peaking right before World War I. And as these people came into ports, into places like the Lower East Side, what we now call the Lower East Side, and intermingled, and had different cultures and different ways of being. We're very working class kind of cultures. People coming out, in from shore, sex workers, people, Jews living there, African Americans living there, all these kind of things. And the elites were sort of seeing this as a deep threat to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. And the conditions of those slums that people moved into were largely the product of elite capitalists, right? Of the way that they profited off of different industries, right? The poor working conditions in factories, the poor land, all these kind of things are coming out of that. But at the same time, they're seeing these things as inherent and blaming the people within them. And that comes out of kind of a charity model that moves into a philanthropy model. And that's very much how we get into the progressive era, where you begin to see how we pity these people and they are to blame for their conditions. But if we make them good Christians, or if we provide them with what becomes social work, social services, and we integrate them properly into the American white Anglo-Saxon ways of being, that will transform these people. And so not understanding the ways in which the global systems of trade that were created by Western imperialism are to, why these people are arriving here, not understanding the ways that capitalism and the extraction of labor and wealth from the environment and from these people is causing these things. So in some ways, it's not like they're not understanding it potentially, right? But it's because these systems feed into benefiting the people who are creating the models that demonize these people. And that's something we still live with today, right? Where we still blame individuals for social problems. So it's sort of the oldest card trick that people are sort of playing, where they're blaming people for conditions that they're creating. And the scientific racism, though, it's not to sort of be able, I don't think you can fully parse, oh, they didn't believe this, they were just using it to justify things that benefited them. I think like white supremacy, it really is a hatred that is created and imbued in people deeply by these systems, right? So people really believe in a racial hierarchy, and they use that racial hierarchy to benefit themselves in other ways and create power and status and wealth out of these things. So it's a complicated sort of dance, and at different times, but it definitely plays out in these ways. I don't know if, Jack, you want to add anything?
Yeah, so just in terms of Hazel, right? A descendant of enslaved Africans, African Caribbeans, Chinese laborers coming into these systems, also deemed inferior. The mixture of these two inferior races is considered to be part of the racial degeneration process, right? So that was the thinking of the time. And to some degree, people still think these things, right? That, we just have to kind of return to a certain kind of moment in which white Protestantism was the dominant culture, and people were put
Well,
in.
isn't that exactly what the last 4 years was about? You know, I mean, their policy was based on that myth that all of these, you know, and immigration, all of these dark peoples were going to be coming to the United States. There's a book that was a part of that last administration's. Bannon had everybody reading it. And and when I read about this, I thought, oh my God, we're going to relive this again.
Yeah.
And then when the president said, I don't call his name, but when he said that, you know, when he talked about his rallies being good genes rallies, you know, and shutting down immigration to everybody but Northern Europeans or Europeans now. It's amazing how those Italians became white, you know, those Irish. But I was appalled and scared, and I thought, oh my God, you know, we've got more work to do, right? You know, did you expect it, or were you kind of surprised by the cycle coming back around?
Well, you know, in looking at past presidents, many of them were as blatant as Spike Lee calls that man Agent Orange, which I think is a good name for Agent Orange, right?
Yep.
So many past presidents, Andrew Jackson, you know, for example, who really was responsible for pushing Native peoples out of the lands that they've been on for thousands of years, further and further into quote unquote Indian territory, and kind of pushing them into
bloody Andrew Jackson,
yeah.
Who was the past president's favorite person, right?
Right, exactly. So we have these presidents, and they were quite explicit. And in some ways, the kind of hearkening back, now it's not all necessarily Agent Orange, but the people he surrounded himself with were actually quite knowledgeable of these past traditions. And you mentioned Steve Bannon, for example, very kind of immersed in this kind of understanding of the world, and really looking to kind of bring things back to the point in which people of color are not nearly as present in American society. So there is that kind of notion. And so there's a lot of accusations back and forth about eugenics and who was worse, you know, and that kind of thing. But really the kind of policies that were being promoted were very deeply kind of trying to bring back those kinds of controls and the command and control and dominance of putting people of color in their place, if not keeping them out entirely, deporting them, keeping them out entirely, responding with incredible violence at the border, intimidation, all of that. And, you know, if it was to come back, and re-elections were to happen, we're just seeing the beginning of something. So it's very bracing to be kind of witnessing this. And there are, of course, global forces in which the conditions of the robber barons that Dura was talking about before, the growing divides of wealthy and poor, the large numbers of immigrants coming in, but also really the legacy of unresolved legacies of Jim Crow and segregation, and the kind of vicious kind of attitudes that these are subhuman people, they're not intelligent, we cannot treat them nicely, we have to kind of treat them like animals. Okay, now I say that knowing that we're all animals. Human beings are animals, right? But it's an attitude that we can just breed them out or get rid of them and treat them as disposable people.
Yeah, and I think just to add to that, something, you know, that I feel, while I have incredible disdain, and I really appreciated the beautiful monologues by the high school students that talked out, so eloquently and powerfully and honestly about how that past, administration particularly impacted them. But at the same time, he was somebody who was just saying the quiet part loud, right? We've been living in systems of these white supremacy, the demonizing of immigrants, the marginalization of people, as Jack was just saying, these ongoing legacies that we have yet to reckon with around, eugenics, Jim Crow, slavery, et cetera, right? And we've had a long time to do that reckoning and have not in really major ways, in ways that can be very subtle sometimes, but those who experience these systems, know them. And so while yes, the movement towards something pretty terrifying escalated very intensely under the past president, I also feel very we put the state exhibit together 2 years before he was elected, right? And we were already incredibly anxious about the ways these systems continued to exist, then under a Black president, right? And so I caution us to feel just relief or a need to turn away at this point, because even if he never comes back to power, or the people who supported him don't directly come back to power, these ideas, they only go in one direction if we don't deal with them, right? They only lead towards these horrible things. They need to actively be much more deeply addressed, regardless of who's president, and that is something I feel very, very deeply.
There is a Confederate flag flying across the road from where I sit right now. And it's, I don't know what a Jewish person would feel if a Nazi flag suddenly started flying. The Germans made them illegal, but it terrifies me. I am 2 generations out of enslavement, and I hear what you're saying. I've also heard both of you talk about eugenics being embedded into our institutions. You just been talking. How can you talk more about that and give us examples, like in which institutions, education, government policy? Can you talk more about that and how people see that?
Sure. So Mindy Folylove, who's a fantastic scholar, psychiatrist actually, who looks at the process of uprooting and gentrification, especially of African American communities, refers to eugenics as a process of sorting. So it's a process of sorting the unfit, quote unquote, from the fit. And part of how that was done, and this is really part of the modern kind of bureaucratic system, is really how Henry Goddard, who is the head of the Vineland, this is in Vineland, New Jersey, Vineland Training School for Feeble-Minded Children. Okay, that was the name of this school. Okay, so it was actually also in New Jersey. Hazel is talking about being put into that institution for women. But these were institutions that were established by the eugenicists, state by state. And Henry Goddard is actually also the father of testing for schools. Wow. So in terms of the ideas of when in the records we're talking about imbeciles, high-grade imbeciles, morons, is really a way of measuring intelligence and who's more intelligent, who can work a job, who is incapable of working a job. And of course, these are all the kind of lower racial types who are way below the white supremacist idea of themselves, right? So meritocracy is really a system of sorting. Now, it's not exactly the same as eugenics, but we can see how this tendency towards measuring, obsession with measuring, is a process of sorting.
Yes, and if you take if you take SAT scores and you take the highest scores, you can overlap those students with the wealthiest zip codes, right? So how is that Yeah, right.
Yeah. Oh, sorry, Jack. Do you want to keep on?
No,
Please?
go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think one of the real insidious things about the eugenics movement, especially it was a scientific movement. It was also a political movement, which sought out to pass legislation, which they succeeded in doing, sterilization laws, immigration laws. And it was also a social movement, right? It was like a cultural movement in which they had traveling fairs that go around where people would have better family contests, better baby contests, comparing genetic sort of material. They would spread these ideas of every, so-and-so seconds, an idiot is born, with a flashing light on it, indicating how often, and so these things became deeply embedded in a way that we swim in them so much that we don't know that we're swimming in them. So yes, it's standardized testing like the SATs. It's your identification documents, carrying an ID around with you all the time, these kind of things. But it's as Jack is getting at, it's the idea that like these hierarchies and these ways of being sorted make sense. And that is the way that the world works, right? That the world works, that you move up, in different statuses, and you move down and you get a job. And, if you do these, different things, you'll succeed and you won't. Like the idea of sort of being able to understand ourselves in a set of categories in relationship to everybody else. These are the kinds of things that come out of that movement and that era, and sort of at this point are really anywhere between 100, the idea that we say have solid borders that are heavily policed is only about 140 years old. And when we begin to think about the first American laws that actually, with each of the Chinese, began to actually regulate that, right? The idea of like taking tests in these ways, it's only about 120, 110 years old. So these are relatively new ideas that we just
people speak about them as if they're just like embedded for all history.
Exactly. And I think that's what it's worth unpacking and seeing. It's not just a history that we're detached from. It's something to think of. Actually, this surrounds me. How can I challenge this? How can I actually think, it doesn't have to be this way? Because the people that fall the hardest get caught up in these systems in particularly hard ways, whether it's institutionalization, the way that testing marginalizes certain people, these kind of things. They fall hardest on marginalized people, Black people, people of color, queer people, trans people, immigrants, right? And those are the people that these systems continue to impact. And those who are most privileged, white, cis, able-bodied people, are wealthy people, are those who can sort of pretend it doesn't exist, right? Oh, I did all this on my own. I succeeded on my own.
Exactly. Wow. So
and
that's amazing. Somebody, I'm getting comments, and somebody says, yeah, the Stanford Binet intelligence test was originally developed to sort out who got vocational and who got professional education, right? They actually still do that in Germany. I have a German friend who talked about the education system, and she's brilliant and works for the State Department. She's taken other classes, but originally she was funneled into into different kind of education, right? Let's turn to the audience's questions. How many files? This is for me. Oh, I'll interview myself. How many files did you examine? What is the relationship between what's in the files and what we hear in the program? So that's kind of really interesting. You guys had like 750,000 records or something like that, right? And obviously, Michael Slade and I did not go through 750,000 records. I don't know. It was the ancestors, whoever asked that question, it was the ancestors. We started going through files. I told Michael, who was a writing partner, and he had really wanted to write a monologue for unheard voices for the African burial ground. But part of our mission at American Slavery Project is to center African American voices in this storytelling, not because I believe that white people can't write about that era. I don't. I don't believe that at all. In fact, we just won an award for something that a woman, Saviana Stanescu, wrote, and allowed us to share. But she'd been through the Romanian Revolution, and so she was getting what we were doing. But anyway, I said, I don't think it's appropriate that you write one of those monologues. So when I heard about the work that you were doing, and then I think I came down and talked to you, Leora, and then I went on you Jack, you had a big not only the exhibit that was inside the Asian Pacific American Institute, but normal. What is normal? The normal, right? And I went on that exhibit tour with you, and I went back and I said, Michael, here's something we can do together. We can go through these records and we can find out what was going on. So he looked around. He was interested in a field worker, right? And so he found Margaret Andrews's file, and apparently the training was for the people who were field workers to do a lot of this on themselves. So she measured her own head, and she meticulously took notes about her farming background and all of that. So apropos to the question, all of that factual stuff was in the records. I found a record for Hazel, and she fell in love with a man and at a laundry, which was really what her job was. Whether she was actually half Chinese is, I don't remember that, and that might be license. But I'll tell you, this is where when I was young, everybody thought that I looked Asian. They thought that I was Chinese or part Chinese. And I thought, what if Hazel was like that? Do you know? She's black, but she's, they don't know, and gossip and everything else. And what would that be? And why would this guy in the laundry really, what would attract them? So that is poetic license. But every single thing that happened to her is documented in that file. And all I had to do as a writer was follow the dots in that file. Why would she run away? Why would she run away from home? Why would she get sent to state? Why would she get sent? And the rope scar, the keloid scar up and down her belly is in the record. So everything you heard is absolutely possible, and all of the facts I got right out of the records. So what else? Yes, Antu and Stina were wonderful. The play was so emotionally wrenching. Yes, and thank you guys for allowing us to do that. I'm sure there's like a ton more stories in there that we could write. This is somebody says, thank you, Leora. Thank you, Jack. We didn't know about this history. These in-depth explanations are amazing, very well articulated. Yeah, only Zoom. Talk about how ASP is a theatrical response. Yes, okay. Yes, and this is part of what we do. I mean, we should be sort of wrapping up, I suppose. But American Slavery Project exists as a theatrical response to revisionism in this country's conversation around enslavement and its aftermath, as Leora was talking about, Jim Crow, obviously eugenics. And so it's one of the reasons why our work is so connected. Here's something else. And so this Reverberation series was created as I thought, well, you know what? I felt like people weren't getting it. Oh, you do plays about slavery. Well, yeah, we do. But one of the important parts is that we're trying to make a connection between these beginnings of America and today. And so I said, well, what if we just had a series of plays that took place today? And we talked about eugenics, and we talked about the breakdown of labor and unions in this country, and we talked about the lack of mental health care and what's going on in the rural community, which are the next things that we're going to do. During the research process, did you uncover any files about trans or LGBT individuals? I would like to know if there was any information back then. Thanks for your knowledge. I didn't. What about you guys?
Yeah, so I can speak to that.
I'm sorry, I keep saying you guys, but I'm just being generic. Okay.
No. I'm happy to speak a little bit to that.
Great.
So I think I'm a trans woman, and so I think that's something that I'm particularly interested in, is the way that sort of gender and sexuality categories have been formed and forged. And in many ways, part of that intermingled group that was that was of great fear to the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant eugenicists were people who were standing outside traditional sort of sexual sex and gender categories. And when we think about places like the Bowery in New York City, and which is sort of this sort of famous kind of history of working class and tattoo shops and vaudeville shows and all these things, and sex work was happening, there's all these different people participating in challenging gender norms and sexuality norms. And also that's happening amongst people who, particularly colonized people and indigenous traditions, people arriving in New York and in other port cities, bringing their own traditions that challenge Western norms of there being two binary genders, or, queerness or other kinds of sexualities being negative. And so at the time of the Eugenics Records Office, many of the ideas we have about, say, what it means to be a gay person or a lesbian or a trans person, they didn't exist in the same ways we do, right? These categories weren't formed in the ways that we were. So people were
what they were, and they lived how they lived, right?
They weren't explicitly categorized at the time by the Eugenics Record Office in these ways. At the same time, they would have highly been, for other reasons, seen as undesirable or unfit, right? There would have been other language that they would use. The term transgender really evolves in the late 80s, early 90s during the AIDS crisis as like a catch-all for gender variance. So it's like, yes, trans and queer people are in this archive, but they're not understood or seen in the same ways. But this is very much a step to beginning to categorize people in the ways that now are very harmful to queer and trans people, right? Binary gender is very much enforced by the ideas of a heteronormative white Northern European Nordic couple that produces children, right? And so not explicitly, but very, very much in the fabric of this.
Yes. One, thank you for the Chinese and African American character, as many Asian and African American families are not represented. And you're welcome. I really wanted to see that. I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and, in the early part of the 20th century, I grew up in the 50s and 60s and whatnot. Everybody, if you intermarried, that's where you were with the Black people. So there were Arab people in my community. There were Asian people in my community. There were, Korean Blacks, Chinese Blacks lived behind us. And I gotta say, with this horror that is happening right now, the hate against the Asian American community, and I think that this kind of understanding, we need to really examine what's going on. Some of the perpetrators have been African American. There's mental health issues, I'm sure, but this is not okay. This is just not okay. And I mourn that, that people don't understand, why we should all be fighting together. But I think, and I guess you guys can say, part of that is the internalization, right, of this white supremacy mindset. How a Black person can go, you don't belong here because you're Asian. That's got to be the internalization of that kind of mindset. And I heard somebody say, that was a Black person, so how could that be white supremacy? Well, I think we've answered that tonight, right? We've answered that. Thank you, guys. It says here, for a riveting and devastating dramatization of a movement that we would like to deny, but as Leora said, denying it or burying it would be the worst thing we could do. People need to know more about these theories and how they have fueled white supremacy. And Jack, you have something coming up, don't you? So people can learn more. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, come September 2021, this fall, it will be marking the 100th year since the second International Eugenics Congress met at the American Museum of Natural History.
Wow.
There are over 400 people all white, probably 95% men, white men from around the world, largely Protestant, came together to talk scientifically about eugenics. And it was endorsed by the president of the American Museum of Natural History and many of the other patriarchs of New York City culture, the head of the New York Zoological Society, Madison Grant, for example, who wrote The Passing of the Great Race, which is the book that Hitler referred to as his Bible.
Right.
He was there. So this was a week-long conference, and again, we don't know about it. The third International Eugenics Congress also happened at that museum 10 years later. So it's time for us to now grapple with this in New York. Of course, New Yorkers like to imagine ourselves as being so open and so pluralistic and so liberal, but the core of the history of the city not only goes through eugenics and how that was infused in many of the institutions and the ways that people were thinking, but also goes to the history that we still deny, which is really how New York and the region. I'm so glad you made the land acknowledgement, Judy, because most New Yorkers do not know the names of the people who were here before. Well, the Lenape peoples, the Muncie Lenape peoples especially. And, so they were here for thousands of years. And all of a sudden,
the African burial ground was on their land. It was originally Lenape burial ground.
Yes. And then so we have the story of the Dutch purchase of Manhattan, which itself is this kind of crazy fable, but that's what sticks. So most New Yorkers don't even know the name of the original peoples here. So there is dispossession of the land, enslavement, really basically pirated labor, stolen labor that was actually used to replace the dispossessed peoples, because those lands that were taken then became the sites in which the very first enslaved Africans in the region were working to help supply the foodstuffs for the Caribbean, for example. And then with that, those extractive processes, it wasn't just beaver pelts, it was also just the extraction from the land. And why was that being extracted? Well, in part it was to feed people, but it was really to trade internationally. And that's how the China trade, which is really the original trade system that helped build the early wealth of the new nation when it was devastated by fire and it was in debt. So the American ships could go and trade in the port of Canton for the luxury goods. So George Washington, in the heat of the Revolutionary War, was kind of trying to find out what the latest porcelain tea sets that he could get for his military headquarters table, right? So from the very beginning, we have the entwinement of indigenous, enslaved Africans, and the first Chinese, but Chinese things were what were here. The Chinese people came later, but it was made by Chinese people. So the way in which each group has been racialized is distinctive based on those early colonial relationships. So Chinese people are equal to things, either cheap things or luxury things. And that's a particular way in which Chinese people are thought about.
Yes, that you've just connected dots for me. I always learn so much from you all. Duh. Wow. And how will we find out more about this centennial?
We're going to be in the news.
Okay.
And it's going to be widely known. It's a big event.
Great.
And what it is, Leora is mentioning the word reckoning. So we're at a point now where a lot of institutions are starting to reckon with their own histories. Great. So this is actually starting at the American Museum of Natural History, which has not been reckoning with that past, but now they're going to be starting to do that with this conference. Okay. And there'll be other institutions like the Ford Foundation and other funders who haven't quite dealt with that past, who are going to be dealing with that. So this is a chance for both that kind of reckoning, but also for all the people who have been basically victimized by these policies and practices are going to be really mainly the focus of what we're doing.
Great.
So it'll be an event really for acknowledging those experiences that have been unspoken and unwritten as you've been doing in your work.
Well, we are going to, follow it closely. We will have information and links and stuff on our website. Hopefully, Unheard Voices Haunted Files will have a place, in that. You guys stay tuned. I'm going to have to do some announcement stuff now. Thank you so much. Oh, by the way, Leora, somebody says thank you for speaking as a beautiful trans woman. Great information. People out there, we sold a lot of tickets. Fridays are hard, I know, but you can re-watch the Haunted Files full show and talk back. Same place, same Eventbrite password through May 13th. On demand. If there were any glitches, they're gone when it's on demand. So watch it again. Get your friends to watch it. Bring people, and it'll be anytime you want to sit down and see this event, you can see it again. Our next premiere live stream is going to be Disunion. That's going to be at 7:30 on May 14th. We're going to be talking a little bit about what happens when somebody wants to unionize in the nonprofit world. I have good news. Don't Dream, which was a part of our Black Women in the Ballot, which we premiered last summer, a couple of times actually before the election. We won. We're an official selection for the 2021 On Air Fest. And so if you go to our YouTube channel, you'll actually be able to see Don't Dream by Saviana Stanescu, performed by Lynette Freeman, who is a frequent performer for the American Slavery Project, and directed by yours truly, and produced by Simone Barros and Zach Betont. And you have them to thank for the beautiful video that accompanied the monologues. And I want to thank Melissa Maxwell, who directed them so beautifully. And I want to encourage you guys to make a donation to American Slavery Project. We cannot do the work that we do without you. We are a very, very tiny little company. We're small but mighty, and we want to continue creating work that educates, entertains, and illuminates. And I think that's about all for tonight. Thank you, Leora. Thank you, Jack. I want to work with you guys on a lot of stuff.
Thank you, Judy, for your great work. It's really an honor and pleasure to be collaborating. It's really great.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Judy, for having us.
Okay, you take care. Bye.